All right, welcome all. Welcome back. We've got a good little group today. We've got a few people that came to the last session and a few people that just newly joining us for this session. We'll run a few of these every couple of weeks, so keep it in mind that we'll keep running these sessions as we break down every Thursday afternoon. Our webinars change, but we'll keep pushing forward in different webinars for different days. So we'll run a couple more EOS ones as well. I've got a few questions through from people, but just a reminder, you can write questions to me at any time. I'll see them pop up and I'll answer them as we go. So I'll call out for some questions when I run out of things to talk about. But you can also use the raise hand button as well if you wanted to verbalize your question rather than writing it down. So feel free to do that and I can unmute you and you can ask your question to the group. And feel free to do that at any time through the presentation and I'll just pick you up at any point when we've got a break. You'll see that I'm running the EOS Augment 3D beta at the moment, which is version 3.0. That's available on the ETC public beta site. So you should be able to pick that up from if you go to the ETC forums, you can sign up for the forum and sign up for the public beta forum. That'll give you access to 3.0 and it'll give you access to Augment 3D as well. If you didn't pick it up already, ETC ran a webinar on Augment 3D or Augmented, whichever way you want to say it. That is available on their YouTube channel, which is called ETC Study Hall, which has all of their presentations on it. So if you do want to pick up a bit of an insight into how that works, it's got some really good new resources come online from ETC in the last few days. One of them is also for anybody wanting to learn more about the console and programming the console with the designer. For some of you, it will bring back some horror memories, but there is it's called ETC on headset. It's essentially a recording of a plot session with Ken Billington in the States, and it's got Act 1, parts of Act 1, parts of Act 2, and a tech rehearsal. And essentially you can program along with that audio recording and the show file from the show, an edited version of the show file from the show. So you can essentially learn in the real world what you've been taught maybe in classes or what you've been kind of hacking together as you go and busk some shows. So it's a good way to just kind of work through a methodology and work through programming a show, because they're the things that usually you don't get a huge amount of time to do is hone your craft in programming consoles. So we've got a few questions that came off the bat. So I'll answer some of the ones that we got through on the. Sorry, I'll just flip to my questions. We'll answer a few of them that we got through on the registration. So first question off the rack is, how do you best use soft pallets? So the question about soft pallets, I'm not 100% sure what we mean by soft pallets. However, what we essentially, I think the question relates to using it over in a busking context. So how do you use pallets or pallets that you've created and busk over the top of recorded cue lists? Essentially, the best way to do that, I think, is to utilize the fader actions and to utilize the faders in different ways. So we all know that our fader pages, and I'm going to bring up a fader page here so you can see it on screen. But essentially, we all know our fader pages give us the ability to lay out each of our faders, and we all know that we can put submasters on faders. We probably all know that we can put, and we can all put cue lists on faders. But what we also can do is we can also put palettes, we can put presets, we can put effects masters, we can put lots of different things on faders. So I talked in the last session, for anyone that was here, about manual timing. What I can actually speak about now is how to put palettes on faders. So what you can do is in any of our faders, we go to a fader config screen, which I'm going to bring up now, which is one of our tabs. So if you look down your tabs, tab 36 is fader config. Now, if anyone's playing along at home and has noticed that the ETC have re-engineered and redesigned the way this tab tab chooser looks, and layout maker, I guess, it displays and controls selector. Essentially what they've done is they've taken away the they've reduced the size of the iconography here, and they've made it in an alphabetized list, which makes it a lot easier to navigate through rather than having to remember that little CP icon is color palettes, and there's that little curve with 3 lines below it is affects channels. So they've actually labeled stuff and given you the tab numbers and everything sitting there. It's a lot more logical than it used to be. So if we jump into fader config, what we can see is we can see the fader config screen that we have open here at the moment. So I'm just going to give us the whole screen to see that. So what we've got is we've got each of our faders and we've got each of our pages on. So we've got 10 faders per page. So you would notice when you're programming on consoles with more than 10 faders, you'll see like banks of 10. So if you've got a 2x20 wing, you'll see the banks of 10. So that's the way it relates in here. So it's your banks of 10 faders. Now what we can do is we can grab one of our faders, say this fader 5 here on our first page. You'll notice I've got inhibits already red. This yellowy color is your submasters. Again, another inhibit sitting here, and this is a cue list. If I jump into my an unmapped fader or a fader that's got no mapping to it at the moment, what I can actually do is I can just change the mapping of that fader to any one of my palettes. So if I jump in and go, okay, I want to map this to a color palette. I want to map this to color palette 1. Now what you'll notice here is that color palette 1's now mapped to that fader. So if I go in and I bring up that fader, so I'm just going to jump back into here. So let me just grab, I'll just lay out the screen a bit better so we can see what we're doing here. So if I jump back in and I'm going to put my fader module here. So if I bring up color palette 1 on the fader, you'll see that it'll bring in color palette for those fixtures that it has active information for. So at the moment, it's got active information for a bunch of different fixtures in my show, probably everything that's capable of the red color palette, and it's bringing that information back for those color palettes. Now it's doing that for every fixture that it has recorded information for. So essentially, if there's information in there, by bringing up that fader, it's bringing it back. Now that's useful to a point. What that's doing is every time I bring that fader up, it's changing my whole rig to red, everything that's got essentially, and everything in the background. So you're going to see it if you've got intensity. If you don't have intensity, it's going to come over the top of what's active. Now, if I jump in and I go, okay, I want to actually configure that and make it a bit more useful for a busking sense, what I can go into, and you're just using these little icons to click in here. So if I click in this top section is where we did our mapping. If I click in this bottom section below that, you'll notice that you've now got the option for channel filter and parameter filter. So essentially I can make this red color palette fader only react to certain channels or certain parameters. So parameters is going to be, do I want it to just be the red, or do I want it to just be the green? Do I want it? So really it's going to just work because it's a color palette anyway. It's already filtered to the color parameters. So that's where we're going to be looking there. Mostly what it'd be useful for is your channel filter. So if I put a channel filter in here of say 40, now this is only working on channel 40. So as I bring this fader up and down, it's only going to be bringing back the color palette for channel 40. Okay, so it gives us the ability to now filter that by able to filter that color palette fader by channel. Now we can do the same with other different types of faders. So if I go into, if we put a target in here of say a preset, and we do a preset 1, if I have a preset 1 in this show, yep, I do, cool. So if I go in, I can do the same for presets. Okay, so I can do a channel filter and a parameter filter. Now the parameter filter for preset is going to be more important because a preset can have any parameter in it. So I could do a filter on that preset that only brings back the pen and tilt or the focus in that preset. So by doing that, I can busk over the top of active cue lists. So if I have cue lists running underneath in any situation, I can actually busk those parameters underneath that cue list. So if I play back a cue, you'll see that when I bring faders back over the top, I'm busking that red parameter over the top of that cue list. Now, when I go into my fader config, I can actually jump in and I can go, okay, I want to look in and I want to go, what do these bump buttons do? Start and stopping effects. So if effects were built in, bump buttons to bring it back off a flash, off buttons to turn that off at a certain point. So we can actually go in and actually be a little bit more structured with the way we set up those faders. And again, we have the ability to bring back our presets as well. So we can put multiple things on faders like this sort of, so I'm not 100%, the question was about soft palettes. That's what I would interpret that question to be, something about a way to bring palettes over the top of that's not going to end up in your manual changes tab. So you're essentially not going to end up with data in there that you can store in, and you can clear it, but you can clear this out easily by just pulling the fader back down again. So that's the question there. Cool. Another question just come in. A couple of questions have come in while we've been talking. Can ETC do both ArtNet and SACN on the one stringer port, or should be one or the other? It can definitely do ArtNet and streaming ACN down the same Ethernet port, and you can segregate out by fixture as well, depending on how much what fixtures you want to send ArtNet or streaming ACN to. Just getting back to that, it's a bit, the only thing to be wary of is bandwidth. So if you're using a lot of channels, a lot of universes, standardizing on one protocol, and preferably, in my opinion, the streaming ACN protocol is going to give you a lot more bandwidth. But when you are pushing multiple protocols down one port, you will want to be a little bit more conscious of what data you're trying to push down, or how much data you're trying to push down that port. So standardize on one protocol, except for the fact that most of the consoles now actually have 2 Ethernet ports on the back. So when we look at setting up our system, you can set up one port to be ArtNet or one port to be streaming ACN. Mostly what you do though is set up one port to be your DMX over Ethernet controls and the other port to be your console backup network or something like that, because they're separable subnets. Now, if you are in the patch of the console, so if I jump into patch, what you will see is that when on any channel you actually have this interface column, which is on the right hand side. Now that interface column gives you the ability to send the signal in either streaming ACN, DMX. So what will essentially choose what interface you talk to those fixtures over. So that's done on a by channel basis. Now you'll notice in this screen that I've got that streaming ACN is active, and so is DMX. Streaming ACN is active there because it's got a star in. The star is telling me that's also the default protocol. So that's the protocol that's enabled by default. I actually can't enable ArtNet on this system at the moment because I've disabled it in the shell. So in the shell of it, when I exit EOS, I end up in the little shell splash screen where I do my network settings. Inside that shell splash screen is where the ArtNet enable and disable buttons are, as also eDMX and AVAB. But if I enable or disable that in there, it'll allow me to enable it in here. I can't enable it without coming back into the shell and opening it back up again. But I can disable certain protocols for a fixture. So if I didn't want channels 1 through 4 to output over DMX, I would just select those channels, click this interface button on the right hand side here, and then what I do is I just jump in and I essentially say just SACN and then enter, and now it's told me that now I've told the desk don't output those channels over streaming ACN. You'll see that I've now put a plus sitting in those sections there. So we can do that on a fixture by fixture basis, and we can essentially do that channel by channel. Yep. So So in short answer to the question, it can do both on both ArtNet and streaming ACN on the same port, but just be wary of bandwidth. So anything over kind of 4 or 5 universes, pick probably 8 universes, I'd say. Pick a protocol. Essentially, if you're doing ArtNet, anything over 8 to 12 universes, you should really switch to streaming ACN. Anyway, in my opinion, it will work on ArtNet. It'll just be dependent on your infrastructure that you've got on the other end. Cool. Another question that just came through, how do I use a tap time for effects when busking? It's a good one. It's a little bit of a hidden trick in the desk. So what we're going to do is I'll start an effect running here. So if I jump into, just check what effects we've got in the console by double tapping the effect button for anyone that doesn't know. So if I'll jump in, I'll grab effect 901, one of the defaults. So I'll grab my movers that are here, which should be fixtures 101. I'll grab 101 through 105, and I'll place it in effect 901. Okay, so that's essentially that effect running. So if I wanted to do a tap tempo on that, I'd go effect 901 or the effect that I've got running at the moment. And it's just learn time. So the learn button, then the time button, then you just keep tapping the enter key, and essentially you're setting the BPM for that effect on as I tap the enter key. So I'll do that again for anyone that missed it. It's essentially we go effect 901, or the effect that's running, or the effects, or all the effects that are running. But at the moment we've got 901. So effect 901, learn. Yep, and then time. So usually we'd go learn macro to learn a macro. Now we're doing learn time. And then it's just sitting there with the command line unterminated. As I keep hitting the enter key, it's now doing that tap tempo on that BPM and by effect. Now notice as it does it, it puts that as red as a manual change in that effect, that running effect. So in my effect status display here, it's showing me my effect, showing me the channels it's running on and the BPM of that. As I tap the enter key, it's changing that BPM. If I want to store that, I record that into the effect that I'm using. You can also use that effect and push that back into the base level effect if you wanted to as well. So if I jump into the effect, you'll be able to push that into the base level effect depending on the effects that you're using. But the BPM is a modifier that goes over the top of the base effect. So we push that into where we want to store the effect. So if we're using the effect in a submaster, we would store that effect with that level. So we've essentially, the fixtures that we're using, 101 through 105, record, I'll just do a focus record only because I want to grab those commands that are there, the manual values that have changed, record only sub, let's do 15, and then chuck that onto a fader, which gives me sub 15 on a fader. With that, and you notice it's playing back the effect when I do it, that now has that effect status stored inside it. So that BPM that we had before. So that's stored inside that effect itself. And we can see that just here. So if you notice now that is sitting there, that's now the effect time, the effect BPM that we had before. Now I can do that again by just going effect 901, learn time, enter. I wanted to change that BPM now. If I wanted to now update that change, I would just go select last, update, and then the sub that I want to update, which would be sub 15. And now that's stored inside sub 15 as well. So I've updated that change and chucked that into the sub as it's there. So it just allows you to do an effect sub. That's a tap time. Cool. So the next couple of questions I got was one's when you assign a color path to a channel in a queue list, it gets a C, but how do you then view which path has been assigned later on? Yeah, that's a tricky one. Let's just jump in, pull this submaster out, and let's just start from scratch. So if I jump through to a queue that we have active, let's just build a color path. So let's go 102. Let's change the color for the next queue. I've got a set of follow-ons here that I'll wait till it stops. Cool. So if I jump to, let's change the color for the next queue. So we'll jump in and we'll just go into color palette 1. Let's record that into the next queue. Cool. So we just updated that. Cool. So you notice it's now changed to red. So for what I can do is I can place a color path. So the way that's fading into that queue is essentially follows what they call a color path in the console. So when I look at my color picker, which I'll open up down here, when I look at the color picker with that channel selected, you have a look at that screen that you can see on the bottom left-hand corner there. You actually have the color path drawn in for that fixture. So as I go back a queue in my list here, you'll see that it jumps back across that color path. As I play into that queue, you'll notice the path that that channel is now taking through that queue. Okay. So in order to vary that color path, we can do that through this page here, color picker page. So I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to take the gels out by using the settings icon down the bottom. Just going to turn off the gels so I've got a bit more room, and I'm going to add in the color path. Now what that then shows me is, so I've just changed the color. So what that just shows me is that the color path that's running through that fixture currently. So essentially it's moving from that light blue into the red. If I want to vary the way that moves, I can change the color path that it runs through to get there. So notice it's slightly changed, varying there. I can also delay, and I can change the way it actually runs through into the color. So hue saturation, I can fade in hue saturation space. I can essentially change the variance of how that moves in and out of that. So delaying the start, delaying the end. So it's changing the intensity of the hue as we go through the intensity of the saturation to determine which color it fades through. So essentially hue saturation, we've had fading in hue saturation space. When we go into gels, what we're doing is we're fading in the gel space. So we're essentially saying fade between two colors, but then push yourself at some point, push yourself a dip in the middle to allow you to get fading through. So if I wanted more of a dip, I could pull down the out colors intensity and change the delay on that. So essentially what it's mimicking is two tungsten colors fade. So two incandescent fixtures with gels fading down and then fading back up again. So a dip in the center. So I'm not seeing a color wipe through those fixtures. So what I've just done there is created myself a new color path. Now, as you can see here on the channel number, if you can see on the channel number 102, I've got a little red C that's popped up underneath there. So what that does is that's essentially showing me the color path that's built under that fixture. Now, really, once it's created and once I've updated that into the queue, which is what I need to do to get it to stick, really the only way to grab that and see what color path is in there is by selecting the fixture that the path is for. So I can go in and I can go, okay, what color path am I using for that fixture? Which allows me to go in and see that in there. When we jump in, we will also be, I'm just checking something while we're here, seeing whether I can see it in here. But when I select that fixture, I'm just grabbing the color path in the color picker and I can see that path. This is probably the quickest and easiest way to see it and adjust it as you go through. Now, once you've also got a color path, keep in mind that you can actually record that as a path. So you can record that as a recorded path that you can reuse. So down the bottom, you'll see here that you've got CP1, CP2, CP3 down to CP101, which is avoid green in RGB. So if I wanted to record this current path, I could just go 102, record path 102, and record that as a new path in the console. So that now is something that I can reuse in the desk. So I can keep reusing that path over and over again for. Cool. So that's so color path is really handy. What color path allows you to do is allows you to essentially choose the path that a color uses for a fixture uses to fade color from one fixture to another. Is the easiest way to explain that. Cool. Alrighty, so another couple of questions coming through. Yes, the networking seminar I did is available online. That's on the YouTube channel, where this one will be. I'll push that through to everyone after. It's the best way to utilize the Mark Q Part 20 technique. So I guess the question here is saying, how's the best way to put a Mark Q into a part? And to kind of do adjustments on those parts. There's a number of different ways to end up doing this, depending on your programming technique and what you want to do. Essentially, what we're saying here is by putting Mark Qs into parts of parts of a queue, it's allowing us to separate out that Mark Q and allowing us to do changes in the Mark Q in the part. So what I'm just going to quickly do to show this is just set up my screen slightly differently for everyone. I'll just push my playback status down the bottom so we can see that. And then I'll run with up the top. So essentially I've got my queue list down the bottom. I now have my fixtures at the top of the screen. I actually have a visualizer active as well, which I will throw over the top once we end up doing this, so that you can see what's going on a bit easier. Now, what I can do here is let's just zero out. Let's find in here, I'll just grab something that's active. Cool. All right, cool. So when we jump into a queue here, so we've got essentially now we've got a cool look. We've got using our lusters. This is a mark queue and a reference queue, and we can see that here with the R sitting in this queue here is showing us where this is the queue where the intensities are coming up, for want of a better way to explain it. This queue previous is the queue where there's marks happening. Now, at the moment, you can't see what time those marks are happening on, except for the fact that I know that the queue time's 5 seconds. There's no discrete times placed on this queue because there's no pluses. There's no part queues. So essentially, the mark is happening over 5 seconds. Now, if there isn't a mark time established in the setup of the console, the default is for the mark to use the queue time. So this is the preset that we're doing for these fixtures. So I'm just going to jump through quickly because this show file's not super familiar. So I'm just going to run through and just have a quick look at what the last queue was. Cool. I'll just jump back. Cool. So if I wanted to get these lusters that are on the screen here, and I wanted to bring them up in our marks, so there's quite a few fixtures marking in here. So we'll use the lusters, which are 141 through 148. So just a quick trick, I'm just going to jump into the summary view just so we can see the channels a bit better. So I'll use the 141 through 148 and I'll put those marks into a part. Now, there's a couple of ways to do it. To do this, I'm just going to actually pull the mark off so that I can show you how to mark the fixtures and then pull it back on again. So I'm just going to go 141 through 148. And then I'm going to go mark enter to pull the mark off. And then I'm going to hit update. Cool. So I've pulled the mark off those channels. Now, what you can see here is that there's an L that's popped up that's telling me there's now a live move. So what that is that's essentially 141 through 148, changing its non-intensity parameters while it moves. So if you can see, I'm just going to drag the visualizer onto the screen so you guys can see that happen. So if I go back a queue, let's find a different way to do that. Give me a second, I'll just set this up properly so you can see that. So the screens are going to be a bit messed up, so just bear with me for 2 secs. Cool, so if you jump, I'm just going to jump back a queue. Cool, and then I'm just going to play into the next queue. So it might not translate as well through the wonderful world of our internet, but we'll just see how it works. So what I can do there is if I play the next queue, you'll see that it will fade into the color as it brings up those fixtures 141 through 148. So if I look at 141 through 148 again, the mark's taken off. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to place the mark on 141 through 148, but I want to place that mark in part Q20, in Q13 part 20. Okay. So the way I'm going to do it, so I'm going to select last, or select the group of channels that you want to put the mark on, and I'm going to go mark is the first button I'm going to hit, and then I'm going to hit part, so Q13 part 20. So what that's going to do is create the mark, create the part at the same time. Cool. So when I do that, sorry, I should have hit Q12 part 20, sorry. But essentially what I'm doing there is I'm inserting the Q into part, the mark into part 20 of Q12. Cool. So you can see that there where it's been inserted into that queue. Now, if I jump back a queue, cool, you'll see that that mark is now operating on those channels, but it's operating in Q20. So in order to see that, you can also see that in blind. So if I go to blind Q12, and then I hit part 20, you'll see the channels that are in part 20. Noticing that it's marked everything in part 20, so all of the marks are occurring over the same time, and that's adjusting. Now, the great thing about this and having that mark in a part queue is if I want to adjust the time on that part queue, all I have to do is need to do is I just need to select the part that I want to work with, and I can just change the time. So I can just go time to enter and change the time on that part. Now that's changed the time on the mark because the mark is inside the part. Okay, so that makes it super simple to see. I can also label that, and I can say marking static LEDs or something. Cool. So I'm labeling the queue to mark the static LEDs. So this is a marking inside a part queue, which is really good practice to be able to separate out where your marks are happening. And essentially, if you choose a system of how to do that, so you're saying all of my marks are going to happen in part 20. That means every time you look at a queue with a part 20, you can go, okay, there's my mark queue, or you can just establish a benchmark of the way that you're going to organize your show file, or there may be an established one for the show that you're programming if you're programming someone else's show file. Or a lot of times there might not be an established convention, and you might have to muddle your way through trying to read what the other program has done, which we've all probably been there. So so that's mark queues, and that's marking. Couple of little tricks with mark queues, just to also remember that every time you're doing that, you need to select the channels. So if you're changing a mark for a set of fixtures, make sure you're selecting the fixtures that you're gonna mark in those queues. Some good tricks to do that. You can use the select active key if you want to grab the active channels. You can also use soft keys to select all the fixtures that have moves in them. So if we jump forward a queue, we'll jump into this queue. Let's take the mark off all of the mark channels. So let's grab 51 through what I'll do is I'll grab 51 through 62. Cool, and then I'll take the mark off. Cool, so I've got fixtures here with live moves. One of the really nice functions in the desk is actually query. So I can query channels that have got moves in this queue, so I can grab everything that's going to move into these queues. I can also query inside a flexi view, so I can go flexi into active, and I can query inside a flexi as well. So you'll see there's soft keys here for moves, there's soft keys here for broken mark, there's soft keys here for marking. So if I query marking, it should grab me the mark channels. So what I can do here is if I go grabbing those channels that we're going to mark, I'll mark them again. But if I jump back a queue, sorry, I'll just show you one more thing. So just showing you how that query function works with the marking command. If you wanted to grab all the channels that are marking in that queue, query and then marking allows you to grab all of those channels. So query, marking, and then enter selects those. Cool. So if I jump forward a queue, I can actually query the live moves as well. So where are the live moves happening in this queue? So if I go query and then I hit live moves over here, it should grab me the fixtures where the live moves are happening. So 51 through 62. So that query function is a really good little trick for grabbing. If you have a queue, you know you need to mark something, but you don't know where it is or what it is. So if you need to do that, all you can do is just go query live move. Sorry, I think I've dropped the visualizer down. 2 seconds. I'll jump through, make sure everyone can see it again. Cool. Back up and running. Thanks. Thanks everyone for letting me know. So sorry, what I was just saying is I think it dropped off while I was doing the query function. If you wanted to do query, if I wanted to grab something inside a queue that is marking, so anything that needs a mark assigned to it, you're just going to hit query and you're going to hit live moves and then enter, and it's going to grab all the fixtures that essentially need to be marked, and then all I need to do is just go mark, and then you can just easily do earliest, or you can go mark Q12 part 20, enter, and then update, enter, and it's now marked that into the queue. So remember that query function. Question as well, do you have a preference for using AutoMark or not? To be honest, AutoMark makes your life easy, but it can also make your life hard depending on if you've got to do a lot of mark changes. I don't use it because I find that placing my own marks on queues is a much easier way to, with that query live moves function, I can quickly just go query live moves, mark earliest, enter, or just mark enter, and I can just place a mark in the queue before anyway. AutoMark does give you the fail safe that you can build a show file in the plot with AutoMark on and then turn it off and change stuff. If you do turn it off, don't turn it back on again. If you do turn it off and and make some changes, don't turn it back on again, because you will not get those changes follow through in AutoMark. Cool. All right, so we'll just run through a couple of the other questions. Cool. All right, so a couple of other questions. Can you use a visualizer on a 4K Classic? You can use offboard visualizers on a 4K Classic. So any of the capture, wig, whatever visualizer you're using, you can use that on the Classics. You will be able to, the only thing you can't use on the old 4K Classics, because it won't run 3.0, is you can't use the Augment 3D visualizer, because that doesn't interface over a DMX over Ethernet protocol like the other visualizers do. That interfaces over the protocol, the EOS proprietary protocol. So you actually have to be running 3.0 software to tether into Augment 3D. So you need a console that can run 3.0, which you can't do on the 4K Classics. Cool. All right. So a couple of other questions that came through while we're doing this. So there was a question about how to use partitions and kind of the best practice in using partitions. Now, if anyone hasn't used partitions before, partitions are a way for the console for you to partition off multiple operators on a console. So when we jump into the setup, so the console has the ability to have, the software has the ability to have a primary, have a backup, but also have clients that sit on the network as well. So we can have multiple operators running one console, running their own consoles, and they all work on the same show file. So the way that networks in is that essentially allows us to go in, let's just jump into setup. What that allows us to do is that allows us to set up both users and partitions for those users. So once I jump into my users, this has really, really changed in the last few versions, and it is a lot better than what it used to be. So we used to have user IDs, and we used to essentially, that was it. We had user IDs and we had partitions, and it was pretty hard to see which user was which, what users were called. You couldn't label users well. What we can do now is we can actually, really quickly, we can add users in to this system. So I want to use a 2. I also want to use a 10. Cool. The user number is just an arbitrary number that you're assigning to that user. Doesn't have to be in order. Now, when we put a user on a system, we will see whether that user's online. So now I only have one user on here, which is me. So I'm seeing that online. If you're seeing multiple users that are active at one time, you will put those users online. The big thing about a user profile is that a user profile allows people to have independent control over the system. So if you're logged in on a separate console, say you have a primary and backup system, and you're both logged in as the same user, you will be doing the same things on the console. So you'll see as you type into the primary console at user 1, the backup console at user 1 will also be typing into the same command line. So you'll see that it's essentially a direct mirror of each other. As you flip screens, you're going to be flip screens on the other user. Well, on the same user, but on the other console. Now, that's a really, really, really inefficient way to program a multi-console system. So what we do is we have separate user profiles that allow us to sit in separate console screens and allow us to build our own profiles out. Now, this is not essentially the same as what other people are doing on user profiles on an MA console, but what we're sitting here is we're saying it's sitting here as separate separate independent users on a system. So when we go, we can actually label those users out as well. So we can call them, for want of a better term, we can call them West and East if we wanted to. So we can label what those users are and what their settings are in that device, okay? So users also have independent settings control. They have the ability to set all their queue times, default queue times, all those sorts of things can be set on the user basis. That is assigned to the show file. So that sits in the profile itself. Okay, so the user settings are part of that. Over and above that, when you're programming a multi-console system and you're actually programming separate parts of a show file, say you have a conventional programmer and a moving light programmer, what you can actually do is you can actually set up partitions onto a user. Now that's disabled by default for good reason, because essentially the default partition that's selected is partition 0, which is no channels. So that's why that is disabled. I still don't know why they do that, but there's obviously good reason, because there's always method. So what we do is we have to enable a partition control. We then have to select the partition that we're going to be part of for this user. So essentially partition 901 being all channels, partition 903 being being multi-parameter channels only. So essentially you're moving lights and those sorts of fixtures. You can also build yourself new partitions into the console that allow you to place separate channels into partitions. So I can go cool. So I can place groups inside partitions, or I can place channels inside partitions. What that allows me to now do is that I now have access to those channels which are inside that partition only. So you see now it's graying out the other channels that are accessed there. So if I jump into live and I drive channel 6, I'm now driving channel 6 to full. If I try and drive channel 31, the channel's not in partition. It's going to throw me up a warning saying those channels aren't in the partition. I can actually drive outside my partition though if I confirm that change, so I can give myself that ability to drive outside that partition. Now the problem with driving outside the partition is I actually have to go in and physically pull that out to grab that partition out, because it's not working through the sneak command because it's not sitting inside my partition. So essentially you're going to set up the users based on the access levels that you want them to have to the rig by default. You can also flexi use partitions, and that's essentially flexing just to my partition, which means that even if I try and grab 6 plus 20, I'm not going to be getting 20 because it's not sitting in my partition at that point in time. So I'm not able to access channels outside of my partition because they're not inside that flexi view. which is probably the main way that you'd be sitting when you're sitting within that. So when I've got partitions active, I can still use all my other flexi views, all patch, manual, show, active. It's just sitting with channels that are sitting inside my partition. Okay. And that partition for me at the moment is channels 1 through 10 because that's what I put inside that partition 904. So if I jump back into my setup screen, you'll see that it gives me now the ability to I can turn partitions back off and I'll get access back to the system. It's not a user lockout system. It's not built as a user lockout system. It's not the ability it's not a foolproof lockout system. It is a programming tool to enable you to be able to program your partition properly. Okay. Alrighty, so a couple of other questions that I had that came through after the last session. One of the big ones was best way to program on like a Nomad system without a console in front of me. One of the really good things about EOS is that it is available in any platform, right from the laptop with a Nomad dongle all the way up to a large scale EOS TI console. So you don't have to have hardware to program the console. I'll tell you what, having hardware makes it a hell of a lot easier to program the console, but there are tricks enabled to make the Nomad system work better for you. One of the big things is learn the keyboard shortcuts. I can be pretty quick on a Nomad system these days because I spend a lot of time learning the keyboard shortcuts. Now, when you look at the screen, you can always set yourself up with a screen that just has a virtual keyboard on it. So you have a virtual keyboard available at any time in the console. That virtual keyboard also has all of your keyboard shortcuts listed in the bottom right of the key. So Q is the Q key on your keyboard. Yep. R is record. Anywhere that it has a little C or a little A is also control. So Control R is record only. Alt I is intensity palette. Alt F is focus palette. Alt C being color palette. So you get to know these pretty quickly, these keyboard shortcuts. And if you do spend a little time programming with them, you can actually build yourself a pretty useful show file. Now that's one of the commands that one of the tricks to Nomad programming. The other one is build your snapshots, and this goes for anybody with a single screen system or a smaller screen system. Build your snapshots and build useful snapshots that allow you to build a system properly. Now, snapshots are really powerful in the console, but they're only as powerful as what you can create. So what I just brought myself back to one screen inside the frame. Now you'll see that what we've got here is we've got the ability to build a snapshot of what the layout is. And a snapshot's literally just a recording of the screen in the state that you recorded the snapshot at. So you can recall that later. Now, if I want to grab a snapshot, I'll build up a screen that allows me to build a snapshot. So I'm going to build up something that looks a bit like, let's go this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have myself have a channel screen in this portion. I'm just using tab left and right to move things around. Before we start, I'm just going to hit Shift Tab and close everything out so we start from scratch. I'm going to give myself a live table here. I'm going to give myself a playback status over here as well. Now on this side of the screen, I'm actually going to give myself a direct select that is snapshots. If anyone doesn't know how to change the direct selects and readjust them, you can actually grab them down in the settings section and you can decide how many rows and columns you want. Essentially, I'm going to take myself back to one column. And then what I'm going to do is resize this screen. So I'm going to build something like this that allows me to do that. Or I can put that anywhere on the screen. If you've ever programmed an MA, it's going to start to look familiar. So what I have the ability to do is I now have the ability to change snapshots over here on this side of the screen that is there, or I can actually make that in the bottom portion of the screen, just because I hate it looking exactly like an MA. I'm going to change it. So what we can do here is let's put on my channels tab over here. let's move one that we had before. Let's resize. So this then becomes one row. So essentially now I have a snapshot screen and I have the ability to go in and change snapshots here. So if I want to record this as my first snapshot, I'll go in and I'll hit record, and I'm going to hit the snapshot key. Now for Nomad users and also anyone on an Iron console, this is really handy. Control S on your keyboard is snapshot. You do have snapshot keys on other consoles too. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this as a snapshot. I need to create a snapshot number. Don't forget to give it a number, because if you don't give it a number, you'll make all these changes on the right-hand side. You'll select a number and it'll just change it, all the changes back to what that snapshot number currently was. So this is going to be a visible workspaces snapshot. Now workspaces are those top three things across the left-hand side of the screen. We have 1, 2, and 3. Now when I have a visible workspaces snapshot, it is just taking a snapshot of what's active inside that workspace at that one point in time. Now that means that if I'm in workspace 2 and I bring snapshot 1 back, I will bring back snapshot 1 into workspace 2. It won't flick me to workspace 1. It is being a visible workspace snapshot. If I do all workspaces, it's like a default layout. I'm just going to change that default layout and all the workspaces are going to be recorded. Now I'm just going to do a visible workspaces snapshot here. The big things to be wary of with snapshots: it will remember which tab you had in focus. So on the left-hand side, it's grabbing tab 1, live summary. It is the tab in focus. When I bring that snapshot back, that's the tab that will be in focus again. So if you were in a blind screen like group list or queue list, you can go back straight into that blind screen through a snapshot. You can accidentally go back into that blind screen through a snapshot as well. So you can actually go through. So what I'm doing in here is recording a snapshot. I want to record the direct selects. Direct selects are telling me what, not that the direct select is sitting in this window. That is the frame and that is the monitor. It is recording the fact that this direct select is currently selected on snapshots. Okay. So once I've chosen all my options, I can select and deselect here. Frame 1, live summary. Frame 2, playback status. Frame 3, direct select. Once I've done this, all I do is I hit the enter key and my snapshot is stored. I'm recording over, so I have to hit it twice. Now, when you're on a Nomad system, which I'm on at the moment, if you tap that key there, the snapshot camera icon up the top right, you will see that you have a snapshot 1 sitting in this screen here, which allows me to then. So when I want to label that, I can actually do snapshot button twice, and I can actually label that as default. Okay. Cool. So I'm just going to delete the other snapshots that are in here, just so that we can create a couple more. Okay. So if I go back to snapshot 1 now, you'll see it's going to get rid of that tab for me, which is a really nice way to clean things up every now and then. Let's create another snapshot that is actually just going to give me, say, my busking sheet. So maybe my busking sheet gives me a playback status display here. It gives me a slightly different layout of my screen, so I get something more like this. Okay, so I might have a full busking layout now that gives me direct selects, so I'll chuck that down the bottom. And then I may have the ability to have my playback status here. I might want my live summary over here. And that's going to be flexied into active to make it easier. So you're seeing how I'm building a snapshot to make it easier for what I need to do. And I might essentially have an effects status display up here because it's the busking sheet and I want to see what effects are there. So I can resize and change around and move stuff around as we go. So I can pull elements down, bring them back up again. So now I have my busking snapshot. If I want to record that as snapshot 2, it's essentially going to go record again, snapshot 2, same settings as before because I just want to have those same workspaces. And then I'm going to label it in the same command, call that busking. And essentially now I have a busking snapshot and a default snapshot. So I can go default snapshot and then back into that busking snapshot that we had before. Cool. So essentially now I've built a way for myself to move between screens only using one monitor. Of course, you can do it by moving between workspaces as well. So you can move between workspaces by doing the same thing, which is a very similar way to operate. But and you can also do that in case you don't know by holding the tab key and hitting the up and down arrows will move you between workspaces. Now, when you do that, you'll only move between workspaces that have active information in them at the moment. Cool. And so that's another really great tip for programming a nomad system. Cool. All right. We're kind of getting to the point where we're almost at time. If anyone has any last minute questions they want to pull through or anything that I've forgotten to answer, what I will quickly run through, let me just give me a quick check of the questions that we've had through. Sorry about losing the screen layout for a little bit there. Hopefully everyone didn't miss too much. Okay, cool. All right, so the couple of other quick questions. I think there was one more question that came through while we were doing it. Oh, merging presets from a show file, different show file. So what we can actually do obviously is merge from one show file to another. This question comes up a lot of how to move, moving presets and different information. One of the big parts about moving presets and stuff from different information into show files is going to be, what do you do when the fixture types are different? So what happens when you move information from one show file to another? We have different fixture types, you have different different channel numbers. Let's not be under any misconception that that's an easy thing to do. Okay, so the big thing is that when you're moving information from one show file to another, that information relies on channel numbers, it relies on presets, it relies on all this sort of stuff information that you built to build a show file in. So one of the big things that you're going to have to do is I find it really easy if I'm doing a big show file to have multiple PCs running sometimes, but also to have the ability to have multiple show files and a main backup copy of your show file that you're working from and you're pulling information into a current show file. So say I'm working with this show file at the moment, show file 4, I'll work through 141 through 148. So I'm going to create a new show file to pull stuff into, and I'm going to pull out of this show file. So let's just go. It's like a million show files on this console. Let's grab a new show file here. Okay, so if I want to pull information from that previous show file that we were just on, which is just here, what I can do is I can actually go, all right, so I'm going to go into merge and I'm going to pull information in. So I want to pull in channels 141 through 148, but essentially I might already have a 141 through 148 into this show file. Now, what I'd be doing is I'd actually be moving those channels inside the show file first. Okay, so if I do have a 141 through 148 in my existing show file, you can merge in. So when we jump into the merge section, I'll just quickly show you where we are. If I jump into merge and we go to advanced, you'll see that when you move in the patch, you can actually change the channel numbers here as well. So I could move in 141 through 148 and put them at 151 if I wanted. So I can pull that information into my show file. So if I jump in to my patch screen, you'll see that that's now moved those channels from that 141 to 148 number into 151 through 158. It's brought all that data with it for those channels, okay, and brought that data in. Now, one thing I really like to do is I like to do that originally in the show. So I like to do clean show files for each different fixture type. So remove in my original show file, remove everything else but the fixture type that's there, then bring that information in, just because I'm a bit pedantic and like to see where that sits. But you can actually do it this way and bring information across. Now, when I did that, I noticed I didn't bring any of the queue information in. So now I wouldn't have brought that queue information for 141 through 148 back into this show file when I brought that in. And I'll show you essentially what happens now if I bring back in my queues. So if I merge in this and I merge in my queues, if I go into my blind queue list and I go 141 through 148, you'll see that there's no information for 141 through 148, which were my original channels. That information because they weren't patched. Now, that information has moved into 151 through 158 when that show file came across. Okay, which are those source files? So the desk is smart enough to move parameters across because it's got those 51 through 158 commands. But what I'd like to see, like what I like to do personally, is move the information within the existing show file to a range, bring it in outside of the range, and then move it back to where it needs to be, just because I like to see that information move in my existing show file and then bring it back in. But it will move across when I've got them in these show files as well. Cool. But at the moment, I don't have any palette information, I don't have preset information, so I'd have to bring that information in as well. Cool. I mean, that's the hour for today, which gives us, I mean, we went through quite a bit of stuff. Sorry about the screen messing up. I don't know how actually long that was messed up for. I was on a bit of a roll with that query thing. I will run through query in more detail for anyone that doesn't use it in the next session, because I think it's probably pretty useful for anybody. Does anybody have any last minute questions before we run off? If you do, feel free to sing out. If you do think of questions that you haven't asked in this session, feel free to email. Best email address is marketing@jands.com.au to send through. You can also have questions from, if you have other webinars, that other information you'd like to know about EOS specifically, we can run little sessions just on that. I will be running an Augment 3D session at some point in the next few weeks. So mostly because the features keep changing so much, I just have to keep myself across them, all of them. So we'll be running one in a few weeks' time. Just keep an eye out on that on headset thing if anyone wants to have a play with that. That's available on ETC's blog at the moment, is the link, I think. And we'll be running, for anyone else that's interested, there'll be a part 2 of the Networking 101 session will be run next Thursday at 2 p.m. So we did part 1 last week, which is available on the YouTube site, from our YouTube site, but there is also part 2 running next week, which runs through VLANing, broadcast and multicast signals, troubleshooting, fiber, those sorts of things as well. So that's available next week. And then we're actually running through a house lighting session the week after about changing over to LED house lighting for anyone's venues that are doing that. But I will run an in-depth kind of advanced programmers session at some point in the next few weeks as well, because it's something that it's hard to run through in a class scenario, but it might be a bit easier if we can just run through some topics. People can just run at their own pace. So I'll run some sort of advanced programming session in the next few weeks as well. So keep an eye out for those. jands.com.au/webinars is where you can find all the information for the webinars. Thanks for coming along today. Hopefully you got some information out of it that you can use when we all start back up again, which is hopefully in the not very distant, not too far away future. So thanks everyone.